He said, I think I killed a lady.
After you've committed crime, you have to tell someone.
Maybe somebody had kidnapped him, somebody has him locked up somewhere in their home.
The real ugly aspect of this was the cover-up.
A young woman is brutally murdered in her own home. But when the investigation goes cold, a mother vows to do whatever it takes to catch the killer.
I realized that I had two choices. I could just curl up in a ball and suck my thumb on a couch, or I could work and try and find Debbie's killer.
Then, a high school senior suddenly drops off the face of the earth. But it isn't long before his father comes to a shocking revelation.
We know somebody was lying about something. We knew they had something they were hiding.
March 25th, 1988. It's just after midnight on a quiet street in Modesto, California. 32-year-old Debbie Whitlock checks in on her 3-year-old daughter, Courtney. Other than her sleeping child, Debbie believes she's alone in the house.
Her husband was at a bachelor party.
But Debbie couldn't be more wrong.
He went after her and attacked her.
Six hours later, in the early morning, Harold Whitlock returns home. But when he reaches the hallway to the bedroom he shares with Debbie, he's greeted by a horrifying scene.
His wife Debbie had been murdered. There was a large amount of blood. The knife that was used in the murder had been driven into the floor of the hallway between her legs.
Harold immediately calls 911.
Yeah, I need the police. What happened? I just came in. My wife, I think my wife is dead. Oh, God, hurry, please.
Okay, I want you to stay on the phone with me, okay?
Oh, God, my little girl's back in the bedroom, okay? I gotta go check on my little girl.
Harold drops the phone and races down the hall to his daughter's bedroom. But to his relief, she's still fast asleep in her bed. 10 minutes later, the emergency medical team and the police arrive at the house.
The injuries on the victim were to an extent where it was pretty obvious there was no bringing this woman back.
From the evidence at the scene, investigators were quickly able to determine was that somebody entered the residence without force, encountered Debbie Whitlock, and then tragically and violently murdered her with a knife from a butcher block in the kitchen.
The summary the officers came up with that morning were no evidence of forced entry into the home, which is rather disturbing for us because it could suggest that the victim and the killer had some sort of prior relationship.
12 hours later in Burnsville, Minnesota, Jackie McDonald is enjoying an evening at home with her husband Dennis when the phone rings. But as Dennis answers the call, Jackie can tell right away that something is very wrong.
He looked so strange. And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Debbie, she's dead. Somebody cut her throat." And I remember going into total shock. It's like a stun gun. Your whole life changes. One minute it's wonderful, and the next minute it's the worst possible nightmare you could ever have.
Reeling, Jackie books the first flight to California. When she arrives in Modesto, she finds that the police investigation is already underway. But so far, the police have few leads. The one thing nobody can figure out is why anyone would want to murder Debbie.
That really baffled investigators at the time because Debbie was a very friendly, open person. This was not somebody who had enemies.
Debbie and Harold had been married for 4 years. They met in 1981 when both worked at the same local department store.
They would go to Harold's friend's bar after work on the weekend, and it evolved into love and marriage.
It was the second marriage for both. Harold also had a teenage daughter, Angela, from his first marriage, who lived nearby and visited often.
They just seemed to have an awful lot in common. They both loved having friends over and taking trips.
Then, just 1 year into the marriage, their daughter Courtney was born.
Debbie was a great mother. Actually, Courtney was the star of both of their lives. They absolutely adored that child.
The funeral 2 days later is filled with anguish. Harold seems to take it especially hard.
I could tell that the man was in misery and that he was in shock. Debbie used to wear this jade charm, and he was sitting there and he was rubbing the charm between his forefinger and his thumb. I felt so sorry for him. He'd lost his wife.
Then, Jackie's own grief comes to a head when she first sees Debbie's resting place.
It suddenly really hit me. You know, that was my daughter with her name on it. And I remember looking at the sky and I just thought, what the hell am I going to do for the rest of my life without her? I realized that I had two choices. You know, I could just curl up in a ball and suck my thumb on a couch, or I could work and try and find Debbie's killer.
Jackie knows she can't see the case through to the end living in Burnsville, Minnesota, so she moves to Modesto, where Debbie was killed.
We put the house on the market, and we moved back to California, where I was much closer to the Modesto Police Department, and I could keep in contact with them.
But when Jackie arrives back in Modesto, she's surprised to find that Harold is the police's #1 suspect.
There was just some concerns that his grieving was not consistent with somebody who had just lost their spouse. It seemed as if it was contrived. It seemed as if he didn't grieve appropriately. He seemed almost aloof. The husband was not home during the assault, so quite naturally he was a suspect.
Harold explained that night for his alibi that he had been at a bachelor party when this killing took place, and after leaving the bachelor party, he had returned home to find this crime scene.
But when detectives interview several others who attended the bachelor party, they learn that Harold left much earlier than he originally claimed.
He said, well, actually, he left the bachelor party sometime around midnight, and then he went to a friend's house.
Leading us to believe that quite possibly he murdered his wife during that time.
But opportunity is one thing, motive is another. And Jackie, for one, can't fathom why Harold would want to kill the mother of his beloved daughter.
He would never have murdered my daughter and left their little girl sleeping in her bed.
Then, in April of 1988, the police deliver a piece of information that stops Jackie cold.
Harold had a mistress, leading them to believe that he no longer wanted to be married, that he wanted his wife out of the equation, if you will, and therefore he had a motive and he had an opportunity.
Early on the morning of March 25th, 1988, Debbie Whitlock is found brutally stabbed to death in her home, a few doors from where her 3-year-old daughter is sleeping. Debbie's mother, Jackie, has vowed to find the killer. But the police already have a suspect, Debbie's husband, Harold, who they've now learned has a girlfriend.
At that point, his marriage to Debbie was over. One of the investigators talked to somebody who said that they had heard my father say he would kill Debbie if she tried to take their daughter in the divorce.
But Jackie remains torn about her son-in-law.
You know, it's sad, but sometimes people just do fall out of love, and that doesn't make you a bad person, or most of the world would be called bad people, wouldn't they?
Meanwhile, a new forensic DNA test is being performed on the blood sample found at the crime scene, a bloody handprint. But when police get the results back from the lab, there is no match for Harold.
But it didn't necessarily eliminate him from being in some way, shape, or form involved in this homicide.
The police believe that the samples taken from the crime scene may simply be insufficient to draw a comparison. They also begin to suspect that Harold could have had an accomplice.
We continue to press him with those same questions over and over. Why did you do it? How did you do it? When did you do it?
But with no concrete physical evidence to go on, detectives are at a standstill, and it isn't long before the investigation begins to stall. Still, Jackie's convinced that someone out there has information on her daughter's murder.
After you've committed such a horrendous crime, the adrenaline is pumping and you have to tell someone.
Over the next 3 years, Jackie embarks on a one-woman crusade to find the man who killed her daughter. She's confident that if she keeps Debbie's face and memory alive in the public eye, eventually someone will come forward with a lead.
I contacted one of the pizza companies and they actually agreed to put flyers on their takeouts. I wanted a billboard with Debbie's photograph on it, a reward, and information of where anyone with information could contact the police department.
Jackie checks in with the investigators every month to see if the publicity has generated any tips.
I would call the police department and they said, he hasn't told anybody. And I said, yes, he has. One person knows.
But despite all her efforts, Jackie remains haunted by thoughts of the man who brutally ended her daughter's life.
I would be afraid to open my eyes at midnight because I thought maybe that was the time she had been murdered. If I opened the door to go to the restroom, I would visualize what happened to her.
Years go by with no new developments in the investigation. Then, in April of 1992, the police get a shocking phone call that promises to turn the case on its head.
Those phone calls came from a penitentiary near Flagstaff, Arizona. The convict on the phone said that the guy in the cell next to him was bragging about having committed a murder in Modesto around the time of Debbie's murder.
Immediately, Modesto detectives head to Arizona and interview the convict.
Things were kind of adding up. The guy had actually been in the Modesto area off and on during the spring of 1988. He was a very violent man.
Investigators grill the informant for details. Did the suspect say he acted alone? Or did Debbie's husband hire him to kill his wife? But as the interrogation drags on, it becomes clear that the detectives are being conned.
That it's just frustrating. He worked really, really hard, but apparently it was just a hoax. I think he was looking for a deal.
The false lead is a devastating blow to the investigation, and police soon inform Jackie that the odds of making an arrest have now become extremely low.
Because this was a crime that happened in the middle of the night with no apparent witnesses, and apparently the suspect didn't talk to anybody, it was extremely difficult to solve. This was an investigation that stymied the police department, stymied the investigators.
But Jackie remains undaunted by the odds.
I mean, all I did was think of ways to get my daughter's story out there, to get her face out there.
Then, 6 months later, she seizes upon a new idea while watching a television show about a psychic crime solver.
And she does psychometry, and I thought, but she will only speak to a detective.
Jackie convinces the lead homicide detective to travel all the way to Maitland, Florida, and meet with the psychic.
People thought I was obsessed. I considered myself a dedicated mother. She was my child, and no one was going to murder her and get away with it if I could help it.
It's been 4.5 years since Debbie Whitlock was fatally stabbed in her Modesto, California home. But her mother, Jackie McDonald, is still on a mission to find her killer.
I knew it would be solved, just have to never forget that out there somebody knows.
In November of 1992, Jackie discovers a psychic detective who she believes might be able to provide a lead in the case. But the psychic will only speak with the police. The lead homicide detective is skeptical, but eventually agrees to meet with the psychic at her home in Florida.
He remarked about how some eerie similarities came up during the interview with this person. Eerie specifics that were not known outside law enforcement.
The psychic asks the detective for an object found at the scene of the crime. By holding this object, she claims she can make contact with Debbie and pose questions about the murder.
She actually held the knife that murdered my daughter.
She was speaking as if she were Debbie, and at one point she said, "I'm dead, but I get cut." The psychic pointed to a little spot on her rib. Well, actually, Debbie had received a very minor cut there after she had died. They knew that from the physical evidence.
While the psychic astounds the investigator, no new leads emerge in the case. And much of the public still believes that the original suspect, Debbie's husband Harold, is guilty.
I realized that a lot of people believed Harold was a suspect, but I knew that Harold wouldn't kill Debbie.
Eventually, my father sort of screamed at the investigator, "I didn't kill her. You're out of your mind. There's no way I killed her." And it was at that point that the investigator said, "Oh my gosh, he's innocent."
We were still seeing him. We were still acting as a family. And I just felt so badly for him.
His life had been very difficult since Debbie's murder. He lost an incredible amount of weight, and he was also just very vacant. My dad wanted to get away from Modesto.
Harold decided to move to Oregon after Courtney was told in school that he had murdered her mummy, and she was so terribly upset.
Jackie is devastated when Harold leaves Modesto with her granddaughter.
I just wanted to give Courtney a hug, and I wanted to give him a hug because I knew the hell I was going through, and I knew the hell that he must be going through also.
But the questions that have been plaguing Jackie and investigators from the beginning remain. If Harold didn't kill his wife, who did? How did they gain access to the house with no signs of forced entry? And why on earth would anyone want to hurt Debbie?
There was a behavioral analysis completed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation who gave us a typical profile of somebody who might be involved in a crime of this nature. But all those leads were followed up upon and examined, and unfortunately none of them ever led us to a named suspect, someone who we could really examine very, very closely.
Then, 6 months later, in January 1997, Officer Ed Steele of the Modesto Police Department is on a late-night patrol when he runs into a man he knows very well.
I ran across Michael Warnell. 2 to 3 years prior, we arrested him for a series of commercial nighttime burglaries. We would occasionally meet on the streets and just have casual conversations. He was trying to get his life together.
They chat for a few minutes, and then, out of the blue, Warnell drops a bombshell. He's seen the posters and billboards about Debbie's murder, and for 9 years, he's been sitting on a terrible secret he just can't keep any longer.
Well, the night of the murder, Michael was in his garage, and there was a loud banging on his garage door. So he went outside and saw his neighbor. He was high on drugs, very amped up, very hyper. So he brought him into the garage and tried to figure out what was going on.
Then, the disturbed teenager makes a startling confession to Warnell.
Said, "I just broke into a house and I think I killed a lady."
For 9 years, Jackie McDonald has been searching tirelessly for any information on her daughter Debbie's murder. But now, Officer Ed Steele has just gotten a tip from an ex-convict, Michael Warnell, that he thinks may break the case wide open. As it turns out, the same night Debbie was murdered, a teenage boy confessed to Warnell that he killed a woman.
I was immediately cynical because a lot of people want to give you the information that's going to unlock the secret door, and I thought that that's what Michael was doing.
But as Warnell continues with his story, Steele is slowly won over. There's just too much clicking to be a coincidence or another con job. Still, there's a problem.
It had been so many years, he only remembered his first name. He did remember some physical characteristics that he described as a young white man who was thin-built.
Steele immediately takes the new lead to the Modesto homicide team.
Information that Ed had gotten from Michael seemed to be promising. It wasn't necessarily more promising than other information, but it was the one thing that was needed to get this case restarted again.
Investigators combed through the census database, looking at every teenage boy named Scott within 50 miles of the crime scene. And 3 weeks later, they hit pay dirt.
We were able to determine that Scott Felle lived in the general area of Debbie Whitlock. He went to Arkansas as an adult. We contacted the local police there in Flippin, Arkansas. They did confirm that he did live in that small town.
The Modesto police immediately get on a plane to Flippin, Arkansas.
We went to Felle's home and we identified ourselves as investigators from Modesto, and he spontaneously said, I hoped you would have never caught me.
That's enough to convince the detectives they have the right man. And on January 23, 1997, police take Scott Avery Felle into custody. A few weeks later, when the authorities compare his DNA against samples left at the crime scene, the results are positive. Felle was definitely in the house that night.
Oh gosh, when I heard that they were going to make an arrest, I was elated. When somebody has murdered your child, they're in control of all your emotions. But once he was arrested, I was in control of him. I had my power back, and that's a great feeling.
On May 26, 1999, Scott Felle pleads guilty to murdering Debbie Whitlock. He acted entirely on his own, and Harold was not involved in any way. But Felle refuses to provide details about the crime. At the sentencing hearing, detectives are forced to piece the crime together from what they've learned over the course of their decade-long investigation.
What it looks like to us is a crime of opportunity. Felle is able to get in through the back sliding patio door, possibly with the intent to burglarize the house. We don't know if Debbie surprised him, but an attack happened right after that. He savagely sliced her throat. And then he dragged her out into the hallway, posed her body, drove the knife between her legs, then left the residence, leaving behind only a blood sample that was able to be matched up with him many years later.
Scott Felle is sentenced to 31 years to life.
Whether he got the death sentence or whether he got life, I didn't care. I just didn't want him on the streets anymore.
At the hearing, Michael Warnell testifies that he would never have come forward in this case had it not been for Jackie's billboards.
The informant stood on the stand and said that Debbie's eyes followed him everywhere. I knew that I had done my job.
As for Harold Whitlock, even with the case closed and his name finally cleared, he is never the same after Debbie's murder. In 2001, tragedy strikes again when Harold Whitlock dies in a car accident.
Harold never recovered. I mean, can you imagine being accused of a horrendous murder and being innocent? Living in a town where everyone thought you were guilty? How do you live with that? How do you get over it?
For Jackie, too, life will never be the same. But she goes on, knowing that her efforts have finally brought a killer to justice.
Jackie McDonald loved her daughter very, very much. Jackie would not close that chapter in her life until there was some positive resolution. She was absolutely critical to the ultimate solving of this case. Without her persistence, it still remained unsolved today.
She's always with me. I don't think there's an hour of a day that I don't think about her. Just because you lose somebody doesn't mean that you don't stop loving them and you don't stop missing them. So we will grieve for the rest of our lives.
While a mother's unyielding faith sustained an 11-year campaign for justice, the parents of a teenage boy are forced to undertake a dark journey which can only lead to the most shocking of revelations. On November 16, 2001, Jerome Muniz steps out of his house in Stockton, California. Like so many times before, he leaves without telling his parents.
And I remember telling my husband that, it was time for dinner and said, go get Jerome.
When I went downstairs, he was gone. So I figured, well, he just probably went to go see his girlfriend or he's just over some friends. So we left it at that. and went on with our evening.
At 5 a.m. the next morning, 48-year-old Rick Muniz awakes with a strange sense of dread. His first instinct is to check on his 18-year-old son, Jerome.
When I opened the door and didn't see the bad slap in, I knew he hadn't come home.
I was a little upset with the fact that I didn't know where he was at and he wasn't calling.
At first, the Munizes are more annoyed than worried. It isn't the first time Jerome has stayed out overnight without telling them.
We told him, when you're gonna stay out late or stay over at friends' house, at least call so we know where you're at.
But as the morning turns into afternoon with still no word from Jerome, the Munizes hit the streets of their working-class neighborhood to look for him.
We just drove around the neighborhood, combing the area,
I had no idea, no clue, and it was just not a good feeling, not knowing where he was at.
Still, the Munizes keep telling themselves that Jerome's disappearance is most likely voluntary. In fact, their son has run away several times before. Once a straight-A student who played in the church band, he's recently been hanging out with a crowd of goth kids, and his behavior and appearance have changed dramatically.
I think it just was, very typical, like any teenager when they want to shut a parent out. I mean, they normally do by not saying anything, and so if you don't know what's going on and they're not telling you, you just assume everything's okay.
But after canvassing the neighborhood for several hours, Rick finally breaks down and calls the Stockton police for help.
And all we got from the Stockton PD was, well, you have to wait 72 hours. In 72 hours, he becomes a missing person.
I think their viewpoint was that most teenagers go out like a runaway, or they stay over at friends' houses, or, they weren't really concerned about looking for them.
But 72 hours is too long for the concerned parents. The very next day, Rick and Jerry take matters into their own hands, printing up flyers and handing them out all over town.
We had a flyer that we put out to the neighborhood and the neighborhood stores.
We'd walk by and show them a flyer and said, "Have you seen this young man?" And they would shake their head and just say, "I have not seen them. Good luck."
The search quickly becomes a community effort. Even two of Jerome's new goth friends show up at the Muniz home to offer a hand.
I thought, well, gee, so wonderful. These guys are coming out to help out. We could use as much help as we can. And they said they would talk to their friends and look around and pass out flyers.
It's now seeming less and less likely that Jerome is partying with friends. But the question is, where could the 18-year-old be? Could he have run away, or worse, run into trouble he wasn't ready for?
Every time the phone rang, you think, oh God, that has to be Jerome. Somebody's calling to let us know, or he's calling to let us know where he's at, just to take the worry off.
That's a difficult thing, because now you're realizing something's terribly wrong.
After 3 days, police file an official missing persons report. But there's little more they can do. Whether there's a crime involved or not, Rick and Jerry are now beside themselves with worry.
Maybe somebody had taken him, somebody had kidnapped him, somebody has him locked up somewhere in their home.
Looking for support, the Munizes go to church on Sunday. The church is the social center of their neighborhood, and there, where they least expect it, they get their first lead. A friend of Jerome's tells them that two local teenagers, Roy Blank and Nick Langston, might know something about his disappearance.
We knew Roy Blank previously because he had come over before as just a neighborhood kid who living just around the corner. Nick Langston, I never met him or seen him before.
Excited to finally have a lead, Rick tracks down Langston's address and drives over to his house immediately. But when Langston comes to the door, Rick is shocked. Standing before him is one of the same goth teenagers who came to the Muniz home 10 days earlier to pass out flyers.
I was getting nervous. I mean, something's, definitely out of place here.
It was beginning to be kind of very suspicious. Your light bulbs go on, so to speak.
Rick and Jerry Muniz have been desperately looking for their teenage son Jerome, who disappeared 10 days earlier without a trace. Now they've just received their first promising lead. Two goth teens, Roy Blank and Nick Langston, were apparently the last ones to see Jerome. But when the Munises arrive at Nick Langston's home, they're shocked to recognize him as one of the many volunteers who had been helping in the search for their son.
We just felt something very strange about that, very weird.
And when Rick presses Langston for information, Langston offers a peculiar response.
All he could tell us is that he left Jerome in the park. That was the last time he'd seen him. It kept hitting me that, you know, there's something that's not right with those guys.
After hearing Rick's suspicions, the police decide to look into the father's hunch themselves. Detectives take the two boys, Nick Langston and Roy Blank, in to be interrogated. First up is Nick Langston, who denies knowing anything about Jerome's whereabouts.
When was the last time you actually saw him?
It was like 2 or 3 weeks ago at the park.
What was he doing?
It's acting very strange. He was on some pills.
Then, it's Roy's turn in the chair.
Since that Friday, is that the last time you ever saw him at all?
Yeah, I think that would be the last time.
Rick and Jerry are full of nagging suspicions. Langston and Blank had helped them search for Jerome, yet they never mentioned that they'd seen him on the very day he disappeared. Why would they keep it a secret?
We knew somebody was lying about something. We knew something was, there. We couldn't grasp at it. And again, we knew they had something they were hiding.
But the police do not feel the boys' interrogation reveals anything suspicious, so they let them go.
No one saw anything, no one said anything that would lead them to believe that. It was, at that point, a dead end.
Suddenly, the Munises find themselves back at square one.
We were just waiting for something to turn up. We really, there was nothing much more that we could do.
They left us with, again, that empty feeling about what are we going to do now?
Then, late at night on December 11th, 2001, 3 weeks after Jerome vanished without a trace, an unexpected phone call sends a chill up Rick's spine.
When I answered hello, the caller said, "If you're looking for Jerome, you need to go to the park. Go to the park. Jerome is in the park."
So my husband said, "Get your clothes on. We got to go to the park now."
But the park is huge, a very big tract of land for two people to search all alone.
It's pitch dark. There's no lights out there, so we just had our flashlight.
We noticed kind of like a ravine, and we walked down there and noticed that there was some fresh dirt, that had been moved out of place.
Rick and Jerry are both having the same thought, and it's a thought too terrible to say out loud.
You felt like you were going to fall in a hole, or the ground was so soft and you just didn't know what you were stepping on.
And I jumped down into the ditch area, and there was tumbleweeds there, and I took the tumbleweeds and kind of started to move them out of the way.
I was just praying. I was asking for strength.
After 26 days of looking for their missing son, Rick and Jerry Muniz get an anonymous call that sends them rushing out in the middle of the night to the park where their son was last seen. Now, at the base of a shallow ravine, their worst fears are about to be realized.
I just kept pulling more dirt off, and you can see the outline of a face and his stomach area. All of a sudden, you can see Jerome. I could see his eyes.
Oh my God, it's just like the whole air was taken out of your life.
I sat there with my son, and I knew it was him. It's the hardest thing to do, but I sat there and grabbed him and held him in my arms, and And I told Jerry, you better go get the police.
As soon as they arrive, the police quickly take over what has now become a crime scene.
The police feared that they could tromp over some piece of evidence that might be important to the case in the dark.
I didn't want to leave.
It's just not real. It was very surreal, very, very surreal. Just a shocking experience.
At daybreak, forensic experts begin the painstaking process of removing Jerome's body.
I wouldn't leave my son's side. It took him all day that Wednesday before they took him out of that ditch and put him in a coroner's van. I wasn't going to leave him until he was safe.
But how could Rick have found his son in the middle of a giant park in the black of night in 20 minutes? The police are suspicious and soon bring Rick and Jerry in for questioning that same night.
And the next thing I knew, I was being put in an SUV and taken downtown. Then asked questions about, did we not stage this whole thing and did we kill Jerome ourselves?
It was pretty clear it wasn't a suicide. Some crime had been committed, and it was police's duty to find out what the circumstances of that crime were and who was involved in the commission of it.
The next thing I knew is that he was gone for that night. That's when we found out later. I'm just telling you what we found out later.
Let me ask you this, did you ever have any guns in your house?
Yep. And that was the hardest thing for a parent to go through. I mean, we've been looking for him for 26 days, and to find him that way, I mean, to be questioned like that was, you know, I was so numb, to tell you the truth.
After 4 hours of interrogation, Rick and Jerry are cleared of suspicion. But the same questions remain. Who is responsible for the murder of their son? And why would anyone want him dead?
I had no clue what to do. I just dug up my own son, and I had no clue what to do.
The police have no leads, but the discovery of Jerome's body shocks the city of Stockton. Among Jerome's friends, the murder is topic number one, and it's not long before people start talking.
At least one of them, a few weeks later, got drunk and told another young person who then, another week later, passed that information on to yet another young person.
One of the teenagers finally tells the police what he's heard, the names of the boys rumored to have been there when Jerome died.
These are the boys that came to our house, pretending that they had concern to helping us look for Jerome, and the whole time they knew what they had done to Jerome.
The police take Roy Blank and Nick Langston into custody and interrogate them again. This time, Roy and Nick admit that they not only saw Jerome die, but were involved.
We were pretty drunk, and then he just got like really violent. He came at me, and like there's like a circle thing surrounded with stones at the park, and I pushed him, and he fell into that, and I didn't think I'd kill him or something.
Roy Blank is charged with murder, Nick Langston with accessory to murder. Blank's lawyer argues that Jerome's death was not premeditated, but an accident, a fight that Jerome started, which got out of control. But, based on the evidence, the prosecution puts together a very different and far more chilling version of Jerome's death. Jerome, Roy, and Nick had been in the park for hours, drinking and taking doses of over-the-counter medication to get high.
Jerome was kind of dancing around, you know, like you would, like a fighter would or something like that, and daring Roy to try and hit him. He hit me.
Then, Jerome goes a step further and spits at Roy. What happens next was clear from the injuries shown by the autopsy. Roy delivers a brutal blow, knocking him to the ground.
Mr. Blank put his hand on his nose and his mouth and further restricted his ability to actually breathe. So what he actually died of was suffocation. I think that he knew what he was doing when he did it.
Realizing Jerome is dead, Roy panics. He and Nick Langston drag Jerome to the ditch and cover his body with leaves.
He and Nick went back the next night and dug the dirt out of the side of the ditch and covered Jerome.
What neither side can explain is why Roy and Nick turned on their buddy Jerome so brutally. The defense argues that they had no motive to kill their friend. The prosecution claims that the combination of rage and intoxication was all the motive the cold-blooded teens needed.
I remember calling my brother, and all I remember breaking down and telling him and saying, they killed my son, or they killed Jay. And I said to him, what am I going to do now?
But the jury accepts the defense team's version of events. They agree that the death was accidental and rule for voluntary manslaughter. Nick is given 5 years of probation for being an accessory, and Roy is sentenced to 11 years in prison.
The real ugly aspect of this was the cover-up. Listen, we're not talking about strangers. These are his friends that did this to him.
For Rick, the sentence is difficult to swallow.
Justice seems to slip away from my boy for 11 years for one boy in probation. And yet these boys still live in my community or live in someone's community that they too may do that again to someone else.
The most that I miss about Jerome, I think, is that he's not there to just be the loving child that he was to our family. And I miss the fact that, you know, that we can't see him.
To think of a man whose son is missing going down in a ditch and digging in the dirt and finding their son's dead body with his own bare hand, it's just unimaginable. It's just heartbreaking to even think about.
It's not so much trying to get over what's happened, but how you get through it. And I think our family is continuing to struggle with that. It's not easy. It's not something that can say, let me put this remedy together and we're healed. We'll never get over it. We'll never have real peace of mind about it.